Begin Self-Publishing, episode 125. Behind the scenes of the Begin Self-Publishing podcast.
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
I haven't really done this particular show before, where I just talk about what I actually do to create the podcast. There's a lot more work that goes into creating a regular podcast than maybe people appreciate. But it's one of these things where you can do it to varying standards, just like you can self-publish an ebook without having read it through at all. You can also create a podcast where you don't spend any time editing or planning or doing anything whatsoever. Now, I actually prefer, from an effort point of view, doing interviews rather than these solo shows. Even though I can just now sit in front of a microphone and more or less do a continuous 20-minute or 30-minute or even sometimes very short shows where I talk about something in just one take. Now, obviously, I make mistakes and fluffs and things, and I can edit those out when I'm going through editing the show afterwards. But for the interview shows, most of the effort is actually on the guest. So I do like to do the interview shows. The only trouble with interview shows is that you are very vulnerable to the whims of the guest in terms of their timings and whether they're available. So there is a large organisational element to booking guests on the show, which is why I haven't had them on for a few weeks. I've had one recently who I booked while I was away at Social Media Marketing World. I'm now getting back into the swing of booking guests in again. So there will be a guest on. Well, there'll be a pair of guests on next week. So what would happen with a typical guest show is that I will reach out to a guest or somebody I'm interested in being on the show. Sometimes I do get pictures from people which are interesting, and I'll say to them, well, do you want to come on the show? But generally speaking, it's somebody I've reached out to on social media or I've met at a conference, and I will send them a link to this service called Schedule Once, which I mentioned before. And what that does is it's synced up to my Apple and Google calendars, and it has a certain period of time when I take podcast guests. For example, I won't interview people on Saturdays and Sundays generally. And I won't interview people too early in the morning. They're not going to have an 8 o'clock in the morning slot with me because I don't want to do that. Though I might interview them at 8 at night. So I shall give them the link, and on that link, when they book it, it does ask for their Skype name and for a picture. And those pictures are the ones that I use in the show graphics that you'll see if you go to the beginselfpublishing.com website, and also on the player and on the Apple iTunes app, etc. Or it should be called Apple Podcasts now. It's rebranded itself. And then at the scheduled time, both me and the guest will get an alert, an email saying like, oh, half an hour's time, you're going to be interviewing so-and-so. And at that time, I will go through and I will turn off my phone, take the keys out of my pocket, put the house phone in Do Not Disturb mode. And basically, I will run some test calls on Skype, because I always do the interviews on Skype. I don't do in-person interviews. I haven't actually got the equipment to do in-person interviews. So that's interesting in itself. And I'll do a test call on Skype to make sure that all the audio and everything is set up correctly, because I route the sound through a mixer and into a digital recorder. So it's quite a complicated setup. And if you knock a cable out, you can suddenly find to your horror 5 minutes before an interview that you can't do the interview because you can't record properly. So I go through this process. I do a test Skype call. And at a designated time, I'll ring the guest. And I talk to them for about 5, 10, sometimes a quarter of an hour, depending on how long they've got and how long I think the topic's going to go on. before the actual interview starts. So this is like the pre-chat. Now, the reason for doing the pre-chat is that they say that microphones they take a while to kind of respond to your voice. So and it also makes the guest more comfortable because sometimes you do get a guest who will be, I just want to get on with this. So you have to just go straight through into the interview. But most of the time I like to talk to the person for a few minutes beforehand to kind of put them and me at ease and kind of get a quick glimpse of what the guest is like personality wise, how much jocularity can I involve in the interview and how responsive are they to maybe totally unusual questions that might come to my mind. And I'm famous for having unusual questions, something come to my mind in the middle of interviews, most of which I don't ask. For a solo show like this one, obviously I don't have to do all the arrangements for the guests, but I do generally write out some notes beforehand. And it can take me days to think of a topic for a solo show. This is why, in many ways, it's easier to do interviews because the subject matter is created by somebody else. So I did think this was almost going to be a how to use and manage money episode. But I started recording that episode and then about 25 minutes later, I thought this is just too big a topic to cover. That may be one that I do in a future episode, but I think it needs a bit more attention than maybe doing recording it the day before, which is what I'm doing with this. So I'll sit down and I'll say begin self-publishing episode, whatever, and then the titles. At this point, the music isn't included. I add in the music in post-production. So you get that nice fade effect. Now, I could actually route the music through the mixer and do it all live, so to speak, all in one take. I don't do that because I actually have a stereo podcast, which I kind of regret with hindsight. But the music to this show is actually in stereo. And it just doesn't really sound the same in mono, in my opinion. And I can't route in stereo music into my mixer. So that's that. So I have to add it in post-production. So there's just a gap. So I'll say begin self-publishing something, then leave a gap, and then I'll start talking. Now, in terms of what equipment I use to actually record the interview, I've got a Shure 55 SH Series 2 mic, which is kind of looks like one of those old-fashioned 1950s Elvis mics, as they say. It's designed to look like that. Now, the great thing about this mic, and with any good podcasting mics, is that it's basically a unidirectional mic. So what this means is it has a very narrow range in terms of where it receives sound from. With those podcasts that I listen to and they have generally terrible audio, a large fact of the reason why they have terrible audio is that they've got the wrong kind of microphone. Now, and you'll hear people who are talking about how they're sitting in a room with polystyrene soundproof tiles and all the rest of it. And I'm like, well, I haven't got any soundproof tiles. I haven't got any soundproofing in this room at all. But that's because I bought a decent microphone that is unidirectional. So if you imagine there's basically a cone coming out of the front of every microphone that's used, and that's where it receives the sound from. Now, if you're just one person doing a podcast or an audiobook recording, then you want that cone to be as narrow as possible just in front of the microphone. You don't want something that's going to be basically encompassing all the room. And lots of people who do podcasts are using a mic where it's designed to take sound from the whole room. And that's not a fault of the microphone. That's what it's designed to do. Certain situations, if there's 2 or 3 of you, you want that. If you're in a group setting and people are talking, you want sound from all around. But for a podcast or an audiobook with only one of you, you want it just to be narrow towards just you. So you're not picking up noises from the computer or the dog barking downstairs or anything like that. It just makes podcast production so much easier to have the right kind of microphone. Now, the next bit of my audio equipment is a totally superfluous device that I bought called a Roland voice transformer. Now, what this does is and I'll demonstrate it, I have done this on a previous show, is it puts basically like a radio effect on my voice. So if I increase it, you see that it goes into proper radio compressed voice. Now I don't actually have it on very much, and a lot of the time in interviews I disable this device completely. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and I actually do think it can, for live broadcasts, it can help with the tone of my, make me sound a bit more sort of radio-y. But in general, it's a total and utter waste of money. Now, that device has an output which plugs into a mixer, which is a Mackie 1402 VL24 mixer, which again is massively overspecified for what I need. The advantage, though, of using like hardware as opposed to just buying a USB mic and plugging it into a computer is that obviously these devices are designed for audio purposes. They're usually pretty reliable. Not going to crash because some Windows update is decided to run in the background, or Mac Yosemite version 752 has decided it's going to crash your computer at that time. So there is a lot to be said for hardware, though what I've got is I've got a 7-channel mixer when I only use 2, which is me and the Skype side person. So there are I have actually seen a lot cheaper mixers which will work just as well. The other great down point to using a hardware mixer is that you need to basically get the right cables to take the input from the computer and then set up your mixing in such a way, which is called mix minus, to not send back that input into the computer. So, for example, if we didn't have that, what would happen was that I would send the Skype input into the mixer, and then it would have a connection back into the computer with my voice and your voice back again. So you would hear a dreadful echo. So you need to, if you're using a mixer setup, because my voice is going into the mixer and the Skype call is going into the mixer, I need to mix out the other person's voice. Now, with just 2 of us, this doesn't seem to be like, well, why would you bother? Why not just plug yourself straight into the computer? And that's one option. But obviously, because it's a mixer, if I was playing in music or sound effects on another channel, then you can do all sorts of things if you get this mix minus set up correctly. Finally, I plug in everything into a Roland R26 voice recorder, which I could actually take out with me to do portable interviews. It's like a sort of handheld, fairly rugged digital recorder. I've never done this because I'm always worried I'm going to drop it or lose it or break it in some way. But again, you could do this on a computer. I know a lot of people do. But it's a dedicated hardware device, and it means that actually, like with this episode, I'm not using the computer at all, which saves on a little bit of background noise and potential interference and all the rest of it. Yeah, if you've got Skype running and you've got a bit of cool recorder software like Pamela running on your PC, and your PC is not very good, then you've got a real potential for things slowing down. And this is why I think a lot of podcasters blame Skype when actually it's not Skype that's the problem, it's their PC. You need to get a higher spec PC or start using hardware. So that's the kind of recording process. Then I basically, if it's an interview show or a longer show and I've got a bit of time, I'll send it off to a guy who edits my shows who's based in the Philippines. I actually got his contact details through Madeline Scalar, who's a previous guest on the show. And he does a fairly good job of doing the basic editing of the show in terms of like adding the music and cutting it. For a solo show like this where I'm quite pressed for time, I'll do that all myself. The next thing I do is I go through and I look for particular quotes in the show that are relevant, take the audio, and I'll also send off the show to be transcribed. So what that means is somebody at rev.com will go and listen to it and type out exactly what happens. It's not that cheap to have done, but it makes a fantastic difference for Google in terms of finding the website and search. And also, I just feel that there are some people who don't want to sit and listen to a podcast. They'd rather read it. So that's why I do transcripts. On the morning of release, so when this show is released tomorrow, I have a checklist of things to promote the podcast. Now, if it's an interview-based show, there are a few extra steps. So I like to pay back to the guests who've been on my show. So I like to write them a LinkedIn recommendation, if I can find them on LinkedIn and add them. I like to add them to a Twitter group, or Twitter list even. And I'll try and remember to monitor that list regularly. I was doing a very good job of that for a while, but I've been a bit slack lately. Because I feel like you have to pay back to people who've been on your show and give them a little bit of love in the longer term. I also schedule out links to that show in SmarterQueue, which is a social media scheduling program that I use. I pin a link to Pinterest. I share it on my own Facebook and LinkedIn pages. I pin the latest episode tweet to the top of my Twitter profiles. And also on Facebook, on the Begin Self-Publishing Facebook page, which is a little bit on the dead side. I pin the latest episode there as a short video. So that's basically more or less what I do for the show. And it actually takes quite a while to do an episode. I'm a lot more efficient than I was in the past. But that's kind of behind the scenes. And I'll try and include in the actual show notes for this a few pictures of like what my microphone looks like for anybody who's interested in that. So I'll talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.